Hi, welcome to this week's edition of PHQ, questions from the personality hacker community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And Addison, let's get right to our question today.
Hi, Joel and Antonia. I'm a regular follower of your work, and I enjoy hearing you talk about ethics, morality, types and development, intuition as pattern recognition, etc. There is always something that brings me back to this one question, though. How does IQ influence Jungian types? And particularly, the high IQs, top 2%, called gifted and more. Some are also called zebras and have a very high sensibility. Not just IQ, but EQ too. I'm a so-called gifted, member of, and tested by Mensa. I was an ESTJ last time I checked, but intuition as pattern recognition sounds very much like me too. I know I'm very flexible on ST, and it is probably due to cognitive capacity. On the other end, I am stiff on the J. I relate it strongly to morality and justice indeed, though everyone knows high IQs make the most formidable crooks that constitute our 1% global elite. In this case, high IQ seems to reinforce the split between judger and perceiver. A podcast about this would be nice. If you have a theory for this phenomenon, IQ, types, ethics, why are the good politicians the most crooked, and why are the benevolent, skilled engineers not charismatic nor interested in politics? Thanks in regard, Laurent.
Thanks, Laurent, for the question. I think we're actually talking... So as I hear what you're asking, there's basically two questions on the table here. The first is, what is the correlation between IQ and EQ and personality type? And then the second part of the question is, what's the correlation between personality type and ethics and, right and wrong, morality, things of this nature? So let's tackle the ethics part of this first, and let's talk about, is there a correlation between a person's personality type and their intelligence and an ethical consideration? Because it's kind of blended together. The type and the intelligence is blended together, but let's just parse out the intelligence part and talk about type and ethics specifically. Is there a correlation between a personality type and an ethical stance in the world?
Yeah, and I would say the short answer is no. I think as soon as you start bringing in the quality of somebody's character, how moral or ethical they are. Now, that's not to say that ethics and morality are going to be equally intriguing amongst type. Or all the types when it comes to Jungian. I'm just talking about Jungian typology right now. So Jungian typology, which has basically been filtered down approximately to Myers-Briggs and cognitive functions, etc. There are going to be some types that are more interested in the topic, but that doesn't mean that they will be more ethical as human beings themselves or more moral as human beings themselves. As soon as you start bringing in qualities that are, about whether or not somebody's like good or evil, right? Effectively, which, we might have some philosophical conversations around whether or not good or evil exists, et cetera, that sort of thing. But let's just bring it down to a level where we're pretending as if there are some people who are more good than others and more evil than others. And for me, that would be more creative or destructive, or however you choose to define that. And as soon as you get to that level, the answer is that people are equally distributed amongst the 16 types as to whether or not they are like well motivated or not, or ill motivated. And that doesn't mean that necessarily is going to play out in reality the same. There are going to be certain types that are more likely to disregard the law of the land. So they may be perceived as less lawful or more anarchistic or not as good people, quote unquote. And at the same time, they, in a completely different context in which there is no law of the land and the person just has to make decisions based on their personal morality or ethics, might shine in that situation, whereas more law-abiding citizens in those situations might not shine because they're waiting for somebody to tell them what to do. So there are going to be certain types that might appear to be less lawful, and that doesn't, as far as I'm concerned, mean that they're less good people, right? And so any gravitation we could have to, basically putting any one single Myers-Briggs type or Jungian archetype into a box of good or evil, if there is any sort of magnet that draws them or gravitates them towards, more lawlessness or less lawlessness, it's going to be really contextual. It's going to be really depending upon the situation, and not necessarily that person is universally or objectively more and less good, if that makes sense. So anytime you add ethics to the equation, it almost turns, I mean, it turns real complicated real quick because it is a system, and good or evil is an emergent property of a system already running. And that includes a lot of subjective concepts around that. But I think that the easy, short, too long didn't read answer is when it comes to type and determining whether or not people are good or evil, the only distinctions or the only trends you could see or patterns are going to be almost semantical, right? They're not really based on any single type dominating any other single type in being a better or worse person. We all show up a little differently. We all show up either having the context fit us or not fit us. Sometimes we just have luck on our side, that the world we were born in favors us and our way of seeing reality. And other times we're not so lucky and we're born into a situation or a context in which we happen to be demonized, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily worse or, worse people. So at that level, when we're talking about the quality of somebody, right, the quality of their character, I wouldn't say that any one type or dominates in that area, or any one or a couple different types get the short end of the stick there. We all can show up as truly ethical people. We can all show up as good people, well-intended and positive. And all 16 types have the capacity to be, the worst of us, the most destructive of us. I don't think that there might be some correlations between, say, type and sociopathy or psychopathy. And I would say there probably are not strong correlations. I would say that there probably have been serial killers of literally every possible type. That would be my guess.
Sure.
And there have been quote unquote saints or people who have done extremely positive things for the world of every type. So again, when you get to quality of somebody's character, it's an even playing field as far as type goes. And then you have all these other influencers around them, like genetics and how they were raised and, basically things that have nothing to do with type theory.
Yeah. And one of the things you got to remember is when we're talking about, for example, the Myers-Briggs system, Jungian typology, we're not talking about behavior. We're not talking about interests. We're not talking about values. We're talking about how the mind is actually wired. What is happening at the cognitive level? How is your mind learning information? How is it taking in things? How is it perceiving the world? And then how is it evaluating that perception of the world? And that really is neutral. That doesn't really have an ethic to it. That's just how you show up and you perceive the world. You take in the information, and that's just how you judge the world. That's how you evaluate that information. That is independent of the behavior you exhibit. So we use behavior oftentimes when we're typing people or we're looking at types to indicate what type they might be. But the behavior isn't the thing. The behavior is an emergent of how your mind is wired. And that's really, it really doesn't have any ethic attached to it. That's a neutral, it's like a hammer can be used to murder somebody and a hammer can be used to build a wall. The hammer's neutral. It doesn't really matter what the hammer's used for as far as the hammer's concerned. It's just there. And that's kind of how we think about typology in your mind. The wiring of your mind, it's not ethical in itself. It's just wired that way. And that's how you're going to show up and learn things and make decisions based on that.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect metaphor, is that how we're wired is a tool, basically.
Absolutely. So let's move on to the second part, or at least the first part of your question we're going to answer second, which is this idea or this notion, what's the correlation between IQ and EQ and Jungian typology? So is there a correlation between intelligence levels or emotional intelligence levels and type?
Yeah, and the short answer on that one is yes. So yeah, there is a correlation on that one. And I think the reason why there's a correlation is quite simply because our type because it informs how we're wired, it's going to inform what we're looking at or are interested in looking at. And so it's going to inform our specialization, right? And so I think it's just a really sort of gross overview, a very simple pattern or trend to be observed is that thinkers have a tendency, I'm going to say tendency, to have higher IQs because they're more interested in the kinds of things that are represented or the kinds of questions that are represented on IQ tests. And I would argue that feelers are probably going to be people who have higher EQs naturally because they're more interested in the kinds of things that EQ measures, which is intrapersonal and introspective and, those kinds of styles of intelligence. So yeah, I would say there's definitely a correlation. Now, there's also an argument to be made that the people who have started these schools of thoughts are also certain types. And so they're going to be measuring for things that are reflective of how they see intelligence. So an easy way of saying this, and what's so funny is that on the YouTube channel, where we posted our YouTube videos about certain types, we said that INTPs in the Myers-Briggs system statistically have the highest intelligence, or highest IQ rather, not intelligence, because we don't really believe in a single intelligence. And for those of you listening, I highly recommend listening to our podcast on Gardner's multiple intelligences to get a more full spectrum concept of what intelligence can really encapsulate. That said, IQ has a tendency to focus on things like analytical intelligence and logistical intelligence, spatial recognition, that sort of thing. And we said that INTPs statistically have the highest intelligence, or IQ, rather. I keep saying intelligence, but IQ. And there was some argument about whether or not INTPs or INTJs have the highest IQ. And I think, it seemed like there was I think it's Marilyn Vassavant who has the highest IQ in the world right now, or at least she did back when I was following her stuff about 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I don't think she's an INTP. That said, I think overall they do. And my theory, and I don't even remember that data is called, so I could be completely wrong on that now that I'm thinking about it. However, I read that someplace, and I don't know how controlled that data was. And I think there's probably a lot more study that needs to be done around it, and a lot of formalization and some control cases, etc. It could be a lot cleaner data for sure. But that said, my suspicion, if IQs are the highest amongst INTPs, is that I bet INTPs are writing IQ tests, right? Because INTPs are the most interested in concepts that are being measured around IQ. So I wouldn't be surprised if INTPs are writing IQ tests, and so INTPs are doing the best at IQ tests, and INTJs following that because they're going to be a very similar mindset. So, or at least the emergent of what they're looking at and what they're specializing in. So same thing with EQ. You read Daniel Goldman's book, and I'm like, dude, there's no question that this guy's a feeler as I'm reading his book. So EQ is going to be measuring things that are intrinsically interested to feelers, or at least that style of feeler. And I wouldn't be surprised that almost all of these instruments that measure things like IQ and EQ, and coming down the pike right now is CQ, creative intelligence. So all of these things are going to be intrinsically interesting to certain types of people, certain personality types. And so the instruments they create are going to measure things that resonate with them. And so certain types are going to naturally gravitate towards having higher scores on those quotient indicators. So there is definitely correlation, but the question is it because INTPs are the smartest people, or certain feelers like INFJs or ENFJs or INFPs or whatever are the most emotionally intelligent? And the answer is, yeah, probably to some extent, but I wouldn't make any hard and fast rules. And also, what are those instruments that of themselves measuring? And is it measuring for intrinsic interest?
Yeah, I think it's a mistake to assume that instruments are objective, and the instruments themselves have subjectively been created by people. And anytime something has been, let's say there's 300 questions on an IQ test or some type of an EQ test or any test that's testing, those 300 questions had to be decided by somebody. That was a subjective requirement to choose those 300 questions. So by the very nature, the idea that these tests are objective and that one type will do better on them because of their type could just be that the person writing the test was a certain type that lends itself to being easier for the one type to answer those questions. So you get this notion that everything is pretty much subjective in the world. And we try to put objective realities around things, and we try to put objectiveness to IQ tests. Now, one could argue it's more objective than other tests, which is possible argument. So it's more of a gradient scale on the subjectivity of something. When I went to take my driver's test way back in the day, I was orally asked 6 questions and I got 3 of them wrong and I still passed, right? So the person asking me them subjectively passed me based on some other criteria besides what I answered on that oral driving test when I was a teenager. So there's all this kind of stuff coming up, and that just think about that on a bigger scale, right? Just think about there's subjective nature to all of this. The embedded in your question is this assumption, or at least that's what it sounded like to me as I was listening to your question, that there's this group of people at the top of the business or world global food chain. They're in that 1%, that top 1% controlling things. And it sounded like, and correct me if I'm wrong with feedback in the comments below this PHQ, but it sounded like you were assuming that there's ill intent from those people just as almost like a rule. and they're really super intelligent and they control everything, but because they're super intelligent, they're almost like super villains controlling the world. And then there's people that, aren't maybe to that degree of intelligence, that are they're lower down on the business or world changing or world domination food chain. They're just doing their normal daily jobs, and they're super benevolent, they're super open and friendly, and there's this split between like super intelligent people who are running everything being evil, and people who aren't as intelligent. They're still intelligent, but they're not as intelligent. They're more kind-hearted and more thoughtful ethically. And I want to be cautious that we don't just gloss over that assumption, because I'm not sure I totally agree with that assumption, if that's what you were saying.
Yeah, I think, well, we talk about this all the time, that whether or not you're part of that, I think he called it the 2%, but we're used to referring to financially the 1%. So I think they're probably kind of similar corollary ideas, that you and I talk about people who are at the top of what could be called the influential food chain, like politicians, etc. And it feels to me to be more of a measure of ambition than it is intelligence. Like there are quite a few people who are orators or are like, politicians in pretty important places in government that I don't know how intelligent those people are. I very much question their ability to keep up with certain conversations. And by the same extent, like this idea that there are really ethical people who would be fantastic. I think this is more about leadership. Like, why do we have a tendency in this world to attract leaders that are not serving us? And there's these like really ethical people who would be fantastic leaders, but they don't seem to make it into those positions of power and influence, which is a really interesting, intriguing question. And I'm sure it has something to do with ambition levels. I've noticed and read many times. I mean, I've noticed this anecdotally, and then I've also read it in quite a few, psychological works or works on psychology and how the mind works, and Psychology Today articles, etc. That the more ethical you are, the more you're likely you are to question yourself. And people who never question themselves, well, not ethical, but thoughtful, obviously mindful people have a tendency to question themselves more often because they're questioning everything. Whereas people who don't question themselves will rise quickly. And sometimes those people who don't question themselves are naturally great people that don't need to question themselves. Well, they should still question themselves as far as I'm concerned, but they don't have as much need as maybe somebody who is far less ethical and not questioning themselves. So I think it's also a matter of like confidence and self-doubt, like sort of that dichotomy of how much are you really questioning your decision making. And that, I think, is totally unrelated to IQ, EQ, type, etc. Like, those are really internally referenced people who just do whatever they think is the right thing to do. And we all gravitate towards what we can perceive as strong leadership. And somebody who's not questioning themselves very much, we mistake those people for being strong leaders. We mistake those people for, we think their certainty equates into somebody who has already done the reflection necessary, and they're now somebody who should be followed. And it's because we're just really, I think as a society, we're just really terrible at talent scouting people who should be leaders. We're not good at it. And so I think it's more of sort of a reflection of us as society than it is the actual person who has enough ambition or lack of self-doubt to maneuver themselves to that position. So I think there's a lot of things that come into play, maybe too much for a PHQ, but there's a lot of components in the system of who enters a position of leadership. And there's going to be, like a person who has certain mental disorders like sociopathy or psychopathy. A lot of people that have those disorders are at high level, positions in companies and in business. I mean, in government. And the reason why is because they're just not questioning whether or not they're doing the ethical thing. So they rise quickly because they don't have to stop and think, right? They just do whatever they want to. So there's definitely that phenomenon. But I think there's also a wide range of people who get into those positions because they really do want to make an impact and they really do want to have a positive impact. And then there's some people who rise to the top because they're super uber intelligent and, they have a talent that way and people start following them. And then there's other people who are like, barely able to get through life on their own, but they have ambition, and that's the trajectory that has been put in front of them, or they're born into a family that's already in that position, and then all of a sudden they're rising to the top. So there's a lot of influencers in leadership and who ends up in leadership and concepts like this that I think it's the emergent is a position of leadership, but the system can be radically different going from person to person.
Yeah, I mean, look at the leadership of North Korea, for example. That was inherited. You know, the gentleman who's in charge of North Korea now, his father was in charge, and he just basically got it handed to him. So, in my opinion, he didn't earn that. He didn't show himself to be a great leader. He just got that entire country and that broken system of North Korea just handed over to him. And having said that, I want to make a comment to all the very intelligent people who we attract to this podcast. And I think it's awesome. I think it's awesome that we value intelligence as people. I think it's awesome that we value emotional intelligence, analytical intelligence. We talk about all the different intelligence we talked about. There's always going to be a limit to everything, though. There's a law of diminishing returns in anything we're talking about. You're going to hit a level where you can continue to, your IQ can just keep going up off the charts. Your EQ can keep going off the charts. Your kinesthetic ability could go off the charts. It doesn't matter what kind of intelligence you show up with. There is a point where there's other factors that are going to matter to you now than that thing, right? And I think there's even studies around this, and even down to like income. Like there's this measurement of income up to a certain level. The income you make in a year's time can actually improve your happiness to a certain threshold. And once you hit that threshold, every dollar you make over that will not increase your happiness. It's just extra money basically in the bank, but it doesn't actually impact your happiness directly. So I believe there's thresholds to everything: intelligence, the money you make, the awareness you have, all of this. And it's really more about the holistic part of you as a person, showing up as your best self, taking those things. I mean, you might be the most intelligent person on the planet. You might have the highest IQ on the planet, but how are you using that in the world? Like just that in of itself doesn't do anything. It's the creativity, it's the emotional component, it's the other things around that intelligence after a certain point that matter way more than the intelligence itself. So, you listening are probably a very intelligent person because you're listening to this discussion, you like conversations like this, and there's going to always be a limit to your intelligence, especially, your analytical intelligence to being able to do big stuff in the world. And I don't mean to say to deny that about yourself. I think you should celebrate that, but just realize there are limitations.
Yeah. Well, and like we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, the quality of your character kind of has absolutely nothing to do with type or with IQ, EQ, CQ, whatever quotient is being measured. The quality of who you are really comes down to intent and, as far as I'm concerned, desire to be better, a desire to improve the situation around you, to have positive impact and create a win-win. But that's, of course, our subjective belief. So this is really interesting. I'd love to hear people's opinion on this. I'd love to hear what people have to say about the patterns and trends that they've seen between type and intelligence and all the forms of intelligence. Again, if you have not listened to our podcast on Gardner's multiple intelligences, I highly recommend going back and listening to that podcast. And just, have you seen correlations, trends? We've seen some correlations and trends, but have you seen correlations and trends in ethics and being a quote unquote good person? And what are some of your opinions? I'd love to crowdsource this.
Yeah, let us know. You can come over to personalityhacker.com, leave a comment under this PHQ or a question. And if you have more questions, if you want to ask us a question, you can go over to personalityhacker.com/questions. There's an audio version of asking your question. You can actually record an audio question. We can edit that right into the recording, or you can type your question into the form that's on that page. That's found over at personalityhacker.com/questions. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next PHQ, questions from the Personality Hacker community.